The war dog had already sent 3 handlers to the emergency room. He'd torn through a reinforced kennel door at Fort Bragg, bit through a Kevlar glove like it was paper. His file said one word in red capital letters: uncontrollable. When he arrived at Blackstone Veterinary Trauma Center, every trained handler in the building stepped back. Every single one, except the quiet black nurse in the corner who nobody ever talked to. She walked straight toward the animal that had hospitalized 3 soldiers, knelt down, and the dog collapsed at her feet like he'd been waiting for her his entire life. What happened next exposed a conspiracy that went all the way to the Pentagon. Before we get into this story, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because we post stories like this every week and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Smash the like button if you're already hooked and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The call came in at 6:42 in the morning, which meant Nadia Ose was already halfway through her second cup of bad coffee when the radio on the front desk started crackling with words that made the whole room go still. Incoming military K9, combat trauma. Handler requesting immediate isolation protocol. Repeat, isolation protocol. This animal has active aggression flags on his file. Nobody moved for a second. Then everyone moved at once, but not toward the intake bay. Away from it. Blackstone Veterinary Trauma Center sat on the eastern edge of Raleigh, North Carolina, tucked between a logistics warehouse and a strip of flat government land that nobody had ever built on. It wasn't a glamorous facility. The floors were linoleum, the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that gave you a headache by noon, and the break room smelled permanently of burnt microwave popcorn and antiseptic. But it held federal contracts for military animal care across 3 bases, which meant the staff saw things that most civilian vets never encountered: blast injuries, shrapnel wounds, stress fractures from years of working in active combat zones. What they weren't used to was a dog with a red, uncontrollable flag on his intake file. Nadia heard about it before she saw it, the way you always heard things at Blackstone, through the thin walls of the supply corridor, through the gossiping between the front desk staff and the junior techs who didn't know how to lower their voices. She was restocking wound care trays in the back hallway when Dr. Preston Cale's voice cut through the usual morning noise. I want everyone except essential personnel out of Intake Bay 2. Whoever is essential, get a bite sleeve. And somebody call animal control as a backup. I'm not having a repeat of what happened at Fort Bragg. Nadia set down the tray she was holding and walked toward intake. She had worked at Blackstone for 2 years and 4 months. She'd been hired as a trauma nurse. Her title on her badge said Animal Care Specialist, Trauma Division. And in those 2 years, she had watched 3 different staff members get promoted over her. She had watched her documentation get attributed to other people during department meetings. She had watched Dr. Cale stand at the front of the room during morning briefings and reference her treatment notes without saying her name. She had also saved the life of a Belgian Malinois with a shrapnel perforation in his small intestine, stabilized a retired bomb detection Labrador who'd coded twice on the operating table, and developed a de-escalation approach for combat traumatized working dogs that had quietly become standard procedure in the trauma ward, credited in the official protocol binder to the department as a whole, with no individual attribution. None of that had translated into a promotion, or a raise, or a department meeting where someone said her name out loud. She pushed through the double doors into Intake Bay 2 and stopped. The dog was massive. A German Shepherd, but built heavier than the typical working breed, with a chest like a barrel and paws that looked almost oversized against the stainless steel examination table. He was on a heavy-duty leash attached to a wall anchor, and even with that, even with 2 men in bite gear standing 6 feet back, the animal's energy filled the room in a way that made the air feel different. He wasn't barking. That was the first thing Nadia noticed. Dogs that were simply aggressive barked. They postured. They made noise to push threats back. This dog wasn't doing any of that. He was pressed against the wall with his shoulders hunched and his head low, and his eyes moved in rapid tracking sweeps across every person in the room. His breathing was fast and shallow. His back legs were trembling in a way that was almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Nadia was looking for it. Standing beside the leash anchor was a man in his mid-30s, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying himself in the unmistakable way of career military, back straight, weight balanced, jaw set. I was a few inches over 6 feet, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of face that had been outdoors in harsh weather for years. He looked tired in a specific way, not sleep-deprived but worn through, like someone who had been holding something together by force of will for too long. "Ma'am, you need to step back," one of the bite gear technicians said. His name was Darren, and he was good at his job but bad at reading animals. Nadia didn't step back. "What's his name?" she said to the man with the leash. The man looked at her with the particular expression of someone who was about to dismiss her and then reconsidered. "Cato," he said. "His call sign is Cato." "How long has he been like this?" "Since Bahrain." He paused. 8 months. Dr. Preston Cale appeared through the side door in a white coat and the vaguely impatient expression he wore as his default face. He was 53, thin, with silver hair, and the professional authority of someone who had spent decades being the smartest person in the room and had stopped questioning whether that was actually true. "Commander Decker," he said, extending his hand to the man with the leash. "I'm Dr. Cale, department head. We appreciate you bringing Cato in. We're going to need everyone to give us some space while we—" "I'm not leaving him," Commander Decker said. Cale's expression didn't change. "Of course. But we'll need to sedate him before we can do a proper examination, and that process works better without—" "You sedate him and he panics," Decker said. "Last vet who tried that ended up with stitches." Cale looked at the dog, looked at Decker, looked briefly at the two men in bite gear. "Then we're in a bit of a situation." Nadia had been watching Cato the entire time. She noticed 3 things in the span of about 40 seconds. First, Cato's eyes kept returning to the same point, not to Dr. Cale, not to Decker, not to the 2 technicians in their protective gear. His gaze kept pulling back to a small black device clipped to Decker's belt, something that looked like a remote rectangular, about the size of a TV clicker. Second, every time someone raised their voice, even slightly, Cato's trembling got worse. Not his aggression, his fear. Third, when Nadia herself had walked in and not immediately approached him, not assumed threat, not projected tension, Cato's ears had rotated toward her and stayed there. Animals did that when they were trying to decide if something was safe. She took 3 steps forward. "Nadia!" Darren's voice was a warning. She ignored it. She didn't move toward Cato directly. She moved at an angle, unhurried, keeping her body slightly turned so she wasn't presenting as a direct frontal approach. She stopped about 8 feet out and crouched down to roughly his eye level, resting her forearms on her knees. "Nobody talk," she said quietly. "To the room, not to the dog." The room went quiet. Cato's head came up a fraction of an inch. He looked at her. She looked at him, but not in the hard, sustained eye contact that animals read as challenge. She looked at his face and then let her gaze drop, then come back. Like she had nowhere to be. Like there was no crisis. "He's not aggressive," she said to the room, very quietly. "He's terrified." "He put 3 handlers in the hospital," Decker said. "I'm sure he did." She didn't look away from the dog. "When they tried to control him." The silence stretched. Cato took 1 step forward, stopped. His nose worked the air between them. "There's something on your belt," Nadia said to Decker. "The device on your left side. Can you take it off and put it on the table behind you?" Decker looked down at the device and then back at her. "That's his training remote." "I know what it is. Can you put it down?" "Ma'am, that equipment is—" "Please," she said. And something in her voice, not soft exactly, but certain in a way that didn't leave room for argument, made Decker reach down and unclip the device and set it on the table behind him. The effect was almost immediate. Cato's shoulders dropped half an inch. The trembling in his back legs slowed. He was still afraid, still watchful, but the frantic edge that had been in him when Nadia walked in, the hair trigger quality that made the air feel dangerous, shifted into something more like wary exhaustion. He took another step toward her, then another. And then the dog that had sent 3 people to the hospital walked forward and pressed his head against Nadia Osei's knees and stood there, shaking very faintly, his eyes closed. Nobody in the room said anything. Decker's face did something complicated. Nadia brought 1 hand up slowly and rested it on the back of Cato's neck, feeling the muscles there, the knots of sustained tension, the places where something that wasn't quite right was presenting in the tissue. Her fingers moved carefully, reading. She'd done this hundreds of times. Her hands knew things her eyes sometimes couldn't see. What they found made her stop. She kept her face neutral. She kept her breathing even. But her fingers had found the edges of something beneath the collar, not on the collar's exterior, but underneath it, along the lining where the material met skin. Old scarring, yes. Dogs in combat environments accumulated scars. But this was different. The pattern was wrong. The placement was wrong. The scarring was consistent with repeated localized electrical contact in the same sites. She had seen this before. Not on a dog. The memory came back in pieces, the way bad memories do. Not a clean replay, but fragments in the wrong order. Bagram Airfield, 2017. A medical briefing she hadn't been supposed to attend. A contractor's equipment review that had been marked routine. A set of injury patterns on 2 working dogs that a supervising sergeant had told her to document as training-related wear. And then, when she'd pushed back, had told her to forget she'd seen. She'd pushed back anyway. And she'd spent the following 4 months being reassigned, sidelined, and eventually discharged on a medical technicality that had taken her 2 years to partially contest. She hadn't thought about that contractor in a long time. She made herself breathe. She made herself stay still. Cato's weight against her legs was warm and real, and she focused on that. "I need to do a full dermal examination under this collar," she said. Her voice was steady. "And I'm going to need the documentation on his training equipment, all of it." "That's proprietary to the handling program," Decker said. "I can't just—" "Commander." She looked up at him. "Something has been done to this dog. I need you to understand that before we have a conversation about proprietary documentation." Decker stared at her for a long moment. Dr. Kale, who had been standing very still near the side door, cleared his throat. "Nadia, perhaps we should let the specialist take it from here." "I am a specialist," she said. She said it evenly, without heat, and the words landed in the room and sat there. Kale's jaw tightened. Decker looked at the dog against Nadia's legs. He looked at the training remote on the table behind him. Something in his face shifted. Not completely, not yet, but the beginning of a door opening. "What kind of documentation do you need?" he said. The examination took 2 hours. Nadia worked with Cato the way she'd learned to work with animals that had been pushed past the point where they trusted human hands. Slowly, announcing each touch before it happened, watching his breathing for signs of escalation, adjusting when she needed to. He let her. He didn't let anyone else in the room come within 3 feet of him, but he let her. Dr. Kale stood in the observation window for 40 minutes and then disappeared. Nadia didn't notice him leave. What she was finding was absorbing all of her attention. The scarring under the collar was extensive and deliberately concealed. Someone had modified the collar's interior lining, added a material that caused the injury marks to be hidden when the collar was in standard position. You'd only find it if you knew to look for it, or if the dog trusted you enough to hold still while you checked. There was more. Cato's stress hormones, based on behavioral indicators alone, were at a level Nadia associated with chronic long-term trauma. Not acute. Not a single incident. Something sustained over months. His weight was slightly under what it should be for his frame. There were pressure point calluses on his front paws that suggested he'd spent significant time in a stress crouch position. He was in pain. He had been in pain for a long time, and everything that pain had produced, the aggression flags, the handling incidents, the red letters on his intake file, had been documented as behavioral issues, as his failure, not as something done to him. Darren knocked on the observation window at around the 90-minute mark and held up a folder. Documentation from the handling program. Decker had made some calls. Nadia went out to collect it, and she stood in the hallway and read through it in about 7 minutes, and then she read it again more slowly. The equipment listed in Cato's training file was standard issue. The remote device Decker had been carrying was listed by model number, and that model number corresponded to a device with a single, federally regulated stimulation level. The device on the table in Intake Bay 2 was the same model on paper, but the device on the table was not the standard version. Nadia had seen enough of them to know. The casing had been modified, the output controls were not original. Someone had changed the device after it left the manufacturer. She was back in the examination room, standing very still with the folder in her hands, when she noticed the logo on the maintenance sticker on the back of the training remote, a small circular emblem with 3 interlocking lines. Her mouth went dry. She knew that logo. She had seen it on equipment in Bagram in 2017, on the case file she had been told to forget, on the contractor's letterhead in the document she'd tried to report through proper channels before everything went sideways. Delworth Tactical Systems. She hadn't heard that name in years, hadn't let herself think about it. She set the folder down carefully on the steel counter and looked at Cato, who was watching her from the examination table with those dark, exhausted eyes, and she had the specific feeling of standing at the edge of something very large, not knowing yet how large, but feeling the shape of it in the air. Nadia. She turned. Commander Decker was standing in the doorway. He'd taken his jacket off. He looked less military and more tired, and she realized he'd probably been awake for most of the last 24 hours. "What did you find?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. He'd trusted her enough to hand over documentation he could have stonewalled. He'd put down the device when she'd asked. He was standing in a doorway at 7 in the morning, looking like a man who was beginning to understand that something he thought was one thing was actually something else entirely. "Sit down," she said. "I need to show you something." He didn't sit, but he came closer, and she showed him the collar lining and the scarring beneath it, and she showed him the device with the modified casing, and she watched his face go through several things in a short period of time. "I used this on him," he said. His voice was flat in the specific way people's voices went flat when they were trying to process something that implicated them. "You used what you were told was a standard device," Nadia said. "You used it the way you were trained to use it." He stopped obeying commands. The program said increase the correction level. There is no standard correction level that causes this kind of injury pattern over this kind of time frame. She kept her voice level. "Commander, the device you were given was not the device it was documented as. Someone changed it." Decker stared at the remote on the counter. "Who would—" "Delworth Tactical Systems," she said. "Does that name mean anything to you?" He looked at her. "They supply half the K9 handling equipment in the Special Operations Program." "I know," Nadia said. She looked at Cato. He had lowered his head to his forepaws, watching both of them. "I ran into their equipment before," she said, "in 2017, overseas." She paused. "It didn't go well." "What happened?" "I reported what I found. To the appropriate people. Through the appropriate channels." She let the silence sit for a moment. "I was discharged 18 months later." Decker was quiet. "I have been working in this building for 2 years, Nadia said, doing trauma work that I trained for in the Army, under people who think I'm a nurse. I don't tell most people what I did before this because it doesn't matter to them. They've already decided what I am." She picked up the folder. "But it matters now because whatever Delworth was doing to working dogs in 2017, it's still happening, and this animal has the evidence on his body." The door to intake bay 2 opened. Dr. Kale walked in with his arms folded and his head physician's face on. The expression that said he was about to make a decision, and the decision would not be in anyone's favor except his own. "I've spoken with the base liaison," he said. "They want Cato transported back to the base facility for observation. We're going to hand off the case." Nadia looked at him. "We're in the middle of an active examination." "The examination is complete. Thank you for your work." "It's not complete. I found evidence of equipment modification that constitutes—" "Nadia." His voice dropped in a way that was meant to communicate finality. "This is above your clearance level and outside your scope of practice. The military liaison will handle any concerns about the equipment." The military liaison works with the same contractors who supplied the equipment. Kale's eyes moved briefly to Decker, then back to her. "Pack up your notes. I'll take it from here." The room was very quiet. Cato lifted his head from his paws and looked at Nadia. She had been here before. Not in this room. Not with this dog. But at this exact moment, the one where the authority in the room told her to stop, and she had to decide what kind of person she was going to be. She had made the wrong choice once, back in 2017. Wrong in hindsight, maybe. She had tried to work through channels, and it had cost her everything. Or maybe wrong because she'd stopped too soon, trusted the system to follow through, walked away when walking away meant leaving the evidence behind. She looked at Dr. Kale. "I'm going to file an independent medical report," she said. "That's within my scope of practice." Kale's jaw tightened. "You do that, and you're filing it without the support of this department." "I understand." "You'd be putting your position here at risk." "I understand that too." He stared at her for a moment longer. Then he walked out. Decker had been watching the whole exchange. When the door closed, he said, "Do you have somewhere safe you can store those notes?" Nadia looked at him. "Why?" "Because I've seen what happens when people start asking questions about Delworth's contracts." He paused. "The answer isn't usually good." She looked at Cato. He was watching her with those dark eyes that had seen more than they should have, that had been trying to communicate something to every person who came near him for 8 months, and nobody had listened until this morning. She reached for her clipboard. "Then we'd better make sure we document everything," she said, "before anyone has a chance to make it disappear." She reached for her clipboard, and what she wrote in the next 4 minutes was the most important documentation she had produced in 2 years at Blackstone, maybe in the 7 years since she'd left the army. She wrote fast and she wrote specific. Injury pattern, location, depth, estimated age of scarring. Device serial number. Model discrepancy between documentation and physical hardware. Observable behavioral indicators consistent with chronic aversive conditioning. She used clinical language because clinical language was harder to dismiss, harder to reframe as opinion or overreaction. She'd learned that the hard way. Decker watched her write without interrupting. Cato watched her too. When she was done, she photographed every page with her personal phone, then photographed the device itself. The modified casing, the altered output panel, the maintenance sticker with the Delworth logo. She photographed the collar lining and the scarring beneath it. She did it quickly and without asking permission, because she'd stopped waiting for permission to document what she could see with her own eyes somewhere around 2018. "You've done this before," Decker said. Not a question. "Filed reports? Yes." She didn't look up. "Had them disappear?" "Also yes." "That's not what I meant." He was watching her hands, the way you move around him, the way you read him. That's not nursing school. She put her phone in her pocket. "I was a $68 for 6 years. Combat medic, special operations support. I worked with K9 units in 3 different countries." She said it without emphasis, the way you stated facts that were simply true. "Then I wasn't. Then I was here." He was quiet for a moment. "And Blackstone doesn't know." "Blackstone knows I have a veterinary trauma nursing certificate and 2 years of experience." She picked up the folder. "They didn't ask for more than that." She left out the part where she had tried, in her first month, to mention her background, carefully, not to show off, just to provide context during a treatment discussion. And Dr. Kale had smiled the patient smile he used when he was not listening and said, "That's very interesting, Nadia, but let's defer to the clinical team on this one." After that, she'd stopped mentioning it. They moved Cato to one of the isolation recovery rooms, which was quieter and had better light, and a floor drain that made the whole space smell slightly less like disinfectant. He walked with her and refused to walk with anyone else, which created a logistical problem that nobody wanted to address directly. Darren tried once to take the leash from Nadia's hand, and Cato's whole body language shifted in about a quarter second. Not aggression, but a very clear communication that this was not going to happen. And Darren gave the leash back without argument. She got Cato settled on a padded surface in the corner. He put his head down but kept his eyes open, tracking the room. She refilled his water. He drank half of it without moving from the position. Decker stood in the doorway with his arms folded and his expression doing that thing it had been doing since she'd shown him the collar, that specific tightness around the jaw that she recognized as a man trying to recalibrate everything he thought he knew about something. "How long have you had him?" she asked. 14 months, he paused. "He was fine the first 6. Good dog. Best I'd worked with, honestly." Then the equipment refresh came through. Delworth issued new gear to the whole program, and he started changing. 3 months after the new collar went on, he bit a trainer. Another pause. "I thought I'd done something wrong. The program told me to increase correction levels." He got worse. "Because he was trying to tell you something was wrong." "Yeah." The word came out flat and tired. "I know that now. You couldn't have known with what you had. I activated that device on him hundreds of times," he said, thinking I was doing the right thing. She didn't offer absolution. He wasn't looking for it, and she wasn't in a position to give it. What she said instead was, "He came back to the room with you. He didn't run from you in the corridor. Whatever he understood about your intentions, he understood you weren't trying to hurt him." Decker looked at the dog. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, but something in that direction. What happens now? He said. Now I file my report, and then I find out who's going to try to stop me from filing it. She didn't have to wait long to find out. The message from Dr. Kale's administrative assistant arrived on her work tablet at 9:14 a.m., less than 2 hours after she'd finished the documentation. It was 2 sentences and formally polite in the way that things were formally polite when they were actually threats. Dr. Kale would like to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience regarding this morning's intake incident. Please bring all related documentation. Nadia read it twice. Then she forwarded her photographs to 2 external email addresses. One belonged to a former Army colleague who now worked in veterinary forensics. The other was a personal account on a server she paid for herself, separate from anything connected to Blackstone's network. She'd learned in 2017 that documentation only existed if it existed somewhere they couldn't reach. Then she went to the meeting. Kale's office was the only room in Blackstone with a real wood desk and a window that faced something other than the parking lot. He was sitting behind the desk when she came in, and there was another person in the room, a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as Marcus Faring, legal liaison for Blackstone's Federal Contracting Division. He had a very practiced handshake and the kind of smile that stayed in the lower half of his face. Nadia, sit down, Kale said. She sat. I want to talk about this morning's examination. I filed my clinical report with the intake system, she said. It should be in the system as of 40 minutes ago. Kale's expression told her he already knew that. I've reviewed it. Some of your findings are concerning. Yes. Specifically, your characterizations of the training equipment. The serial number on the device doesn't match the model documentation in Commander Decker's handling file, she said. That's not a characterization. That's a discrepancy in the records. Faring leaned forward slightly. These are complex systems with multiple maintenance cycles and documentation updates. A serial number discrepancy is often the result of a routine hardware swap that doesn't get reflected in field documentation immediately. And the modification to the output controls, she said? Is that also a documentation lag? A small pause. Nadia, Kale said, you are an excellent nurse. Your patient care work is not in question. She had heard this before. Not these exact words, but this exact sentence, this structure. You are good at the small thing we allow you. Now stop reaching for the larger thing. But you're a trauma care specialist, Kale continued, not an equipment analyst, not a contractor compliance officer. What you're describing requires investigation by people with the appropriate clearance and expertise. Then those people should investigate it. They will. He folded his hands on the desk. What I need from you is to step back from this case and allow the proper channels to handle it. What happens to Cato while the proper channels handle it? He'll be transferred back to base care. He won't allow anyone else to handle him. That's a management issue for the military unit, not for us. She looked at Faring. He was watching her with steady, patient eyes that were not friendly. She looked back at Kale. My report is filed, she said. I can't unfile it. No, he said. But you can submit a supplemental note clarifying the limits of your analysis. I won't do that. Silence. Kale set down his pen. I want to be straightforward with you. Blackstone's federal contracts come up for renewal in 7 weeks. Telworth Tactical Systems is a significant partner in the military procurement chain. If your report is read as an accusation of equipment fraud against a federal contractor, the people reviewing our contract renewal will know that name was attached to a controversy that originated in this building. He let that settle. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to be thoughtful about what you're putting your name on. She thought about 2017. About the sergeant who had said something similar, more or less, not asking her to lie, just to be thoughtful, just to consider the larger picture. She had been thoughtful. She had gone through channels. She had been discharged thoughtful within 18 months. I'll be thoughtful, she said. I'm keeping my report. She stood up. Nadia. Kale's voice was quiet and had something in it that was not quite anger. You're making this very difficult. I know, she said. I've been told that before. She found Decker in the corridor outside Cato's recovery room, standing against the wall with a cup of vending machine coffee and the look of a man who had been awake for too long thinking about things he couldn't stop thinking about. They asked you to walk it back, he said when he saw her face. They asked me to clarify the limits of my analysis. Same thing. Yes. He stared at his coffee. They called base command while you were in there. I got a message from my unit liaison saying the case has been referred to the contractor's internal quality review. He looked up. Delworth is going to investigate Delworth. Of course they were. Of course that was exactly what was going to happen. The loop closing on itself the same way it had in 2017. The system designed so that the thing doing the harm was also the thing assigned to assess the harm. She had believed once that if you found the right level to report to, the right person with the right authority, the system would correct itself. She had burned that belief down to ash in Bagram, and she had not built it back. I need to talk to someone outside the contractor chain, she said. I know a JAG officer, Decker said. She's based at Fort Liberty. We were in the same unit. He paused. She doesn't owe Delworth anything. Does she owe you anything? She might. We'll see. He pulled out his phone. I'll make a call. While he stepped away, Nadia went back into Cato's room. The dog looked up when she came in, his tail moving once. Not a happy wag, more of an acknowledgement. She sat on the floor next to his padded surface, which she would not have done in front of Dr. Kale, who thought floor sitting was unprofessional, but which she did constantly because animals in distress needed proximity and height differential mattered. She put her hand on Cato's side and felt his breathing, still elevated but slower than it had been this morning. You've been trying to tell someone for 8 months, she said quietly. He exhaled through his nose, his eyes closed halfway. She thought about the folder in her bag, about the Delworth logo on the maintenance sticker, about the fact that she had reported that company's equipment irregularities in 2017 and had spent the next 2 years watching her military career get quietly dismantled from the inside, reassigned to positions that didn't use her training, evaluated on metrics that made her look mediocre, until a medical board had found a borderline finding in a routine exam and used it to process her out. She had never been able to prove the connection between her report and what happened afterward. Couldn't prove it. Just knew it the way you knew things that were true, but unprovable, in the part of your gut that didn't argue. What she had now was different. What she had now was physical evidence on an animal's body, a documented equipment discrepancy, a chain of custody she could testify to, and a military officer who had been in the room when she found it. It wasn't enough yet, but it was more than she'd had in 2017. Decker came back 20 minutes later with a different quality of energy, still tired, but with something purposeful underneath it. JAG officer's name is Captain Renata Voss, he said. She's coming here. Nadia looked up. When? She was already on the highway. She's 40 minutes out. He paused. She said she's had Delworth on her radar for 6 months. Apparently there's been a pattern of K9 early retirements across multiple units. Animals flagged as unmanageable, transferred, retired early. She hasn't been able to find a common thread. He looked at the folder in Nadia's bag. Until now, maybe. The weight of it settled differently then. Not just Cato, not just one dog, one handler, one modified device. A pattern. Multiple animals, multiple units, spread across enough distance and time that no single person would have seen it all. Except that patterns like this always produced outliers. People who saw 2 data points and couldn't stop thinking about the line between them. She had been that outlier in 2017, and she was apparently still that outlier now, just 7 years later, and 300 miles from where it started. She stood up. We need to secure the physical evidence before Faring finds a reason to have it transferred with Cato. Already thought of that. Decker reached into his jacket and produced a small evidence bag, the kind used for field documentation, which meant he'd had it on him. I took the device off the table in intake bay 2 before I came out. It's logged in my unit's chain of custody, not Blackstone's. She stared at him. I've been in the military for 14 years, he said. I know what it looks like when evidence is about to walk. It was the first moment she actually trusted him, not cautiously, not provisionally, but in the uncomplicated way you trusted someone who had anticipated the next move before you said it. I also called the veterinary forensics unit at Fort Liberty, he continued. They want to do an independent examination of Cato's injury pattern, separate from anything Blackstone documents. Cale won't allow. He doesn't have authority over military working dog care once I invoke unit medical jurisdiction, which I just did. He said it without satisfaction, just factually. Cato is technically military property. I can request transfer to military veterinary care at any time. Blackstone can't override that. Nadia absorbed this. You should have led with that this morning. This morning I didn't know what was happening to my dog. He looked at Cato. Now I do. The next hour moved in the specific way that hours moved when multiple things were happening and you couldn't fully control any of them. Nadia transferred her documentation to a physical printed copy, witnessed by Decker, and secured a copy with the timestamps intact. Darren came to the door of the recovery room twice, once to say that Cale wanted an update on Cato's status, and once to say that a representative from Delworth's regional office had called Blackstone and asked to speak with whoever had filed the morning's intake report. Nadia told Darren to tell Cale that Cato's status was stable and to tell the Delworth representative that she was unavailable. Darren looked at her with an expression that suggested he thought she was making a serious mistake. She probably was. She'd made serious mistakes before and she was still here. Captain Renata Voss arrived at 11:52 a.m. She was not what Nadia had expected from the words JAG officer, or rather, she was exactly that. But the JAG officer energy was layered over something sharper and more kinetic. She was in her early 40s, with close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of posture that came from years of presenting arguments in rooms full of people who'd rather she wasn't there. She shook Nadia's hand with the handshake of someone who had decided about you in the first 5 seconds and would tell you which way she'd decided without being asked. Decker says you found evidence of equipment modification, she said, no preamble. Yes. Show me. Nadia showed her. The device, the documentation, the photographs, the caller, the injury pattern report, the Delworth maintenance sticker. She talked Voss through everything in the order she'd found it, because order mattered. It established the timeline. It showed that she hadn't known what she was looking for when she started, which meant she hadn't framed the findings to fit a conclusion. Voss listened without interrupting. She looked at everything. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both about specific technical details, and both were exactly the questions that Nadia would have asked if she'd been the one evaluating someone else's findings. When it was done, Voss was quiet for about 15 seconds. I've been trying to build this case for 6 months, she said. I had pattern. I had numbers. I didn't have physical evidence. She looked at the device in the evidence bag. This is physical evidence. What happens now? Decker asked. I open a formal investigation under the military justice framework. That means Delworth's cooperation with any internal review is superseded by our process. She looked at Nadia. Your report stays on file exactly as you filed it. Nobody gets to supplement it without going through me. Nadia felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. There's going to be pushback, Voss said. Delworth has lawyers who are very good at making things complicated, and Blackstone is going to be unhappy. Blackstone is already unhappy, Nadia said. Voss almost smiled. Get used to that. She turned to Decker. I want Cato transferred to Fort Liberty Veterinary Care this afternoon. Blackstone doesn't get to process him out of their system on a convenience transfer before we document the injury pattern independently. Already filed the jurisdiction request, Decker said. Voss looked at him with a brief expression of approval. Good. She started making calls in the corridor, quiet, efficient calls that involved a lot of yes and understood, and I need that authorization by end of day. Nadia stood in the doorway of Cato's recovery room and watched her and felt, for the first time since 9:14 a.m., that the thing she'd set in motion might not get stopped before it got somewhere. That was when her work tablet buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was an internal Blackstone notification, not a message, but an automated HR system alert, the kind that got generated when an employment status change was initiated. Her access credentials had been flagged for administrative review. It was not a termination, not yet. It was the step before the step, the thing they did to create paperwork, to establish that a review had been initiated, so that anything that followed looked procedural rather than retaliatory. She had seen this move before, not in a job, but in a uniform, and the memory of it sat in her stomach like a stone. She looked at the alert for a long moment. Then she looked at Cato, who was looking back at her with those dark eyes that had been trying to communicate something for 8 months. She thought about the sergeant in Bagram, who had told her to be thoughtful. She thought about the medical board that had found something borderline in a routine exam. She thought about 2 years of doing work that got attributed to other people, and 3 promotions that went to people who had asked fewer questions, and a title on her badge that said specialist when she had the training of someone who should have been running the department. She thought about all of that, and then she closed the alert without responding to it and went back into the room with her dog. Her dog. She noticed she'd thought it that way and didn't correct herself. Voss came back through the door 5 minutes later with her phone in her hand and a look on her face that Nadia had not seen there before. Not the sharp efficiency of the past hour, but something tight and urgent underneath it. "I just got off the phone with the forensics team at Fort Liberty," she said. "What did they find?" "They haven't examined Cato yet. They were running a background check on the device serial number you photographed." She paused. "That serial number is registered to an equipment batch that was officially decommissioned and destroyed in 2021. According to Delworth's own records, that device doesn't exist anymore." The room went very still. "Then where did it come from?" Decker said. Voss looked at the evidence bag in his hand. "That is a very good question, and it gets worse." She looked at Nadia directly. "The decommissioned batch, 18 devices, officially destroyed per military contract requirements. They were part of the same procurement cycle that your 2017 complaint referenced." Nadia heard the words, understood them, felt the timeline snap into focus like something clicking into alignment after years of being slightly wrong. 18 devices that Delworth had declared destroyed, at least one of which had ended up on a working dog 8 months ago, modified, with its output limits removed. "They kept them," she said. "It looks that way. And if they kept one, then they potentially kept all 18. Voss's voice was level, but her eyes were not. "And if they've been deploying unregistered, modified equipment across the K9 program for 4 years. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The math was sitting in the room between all 3 of them, enormous and terrible. How many dogs, how many handlers, how many behavioral flags and early retirements and animals labeled dangerous when they were actually just in pain and trying to say so. Nadia looked at Cato. He had gotten to his feet. He was standing on the padded surface, not in distress, not trembling. He was just standing and looking at her the way he'd looked at her since she'd walked into intake bay 2 that morning, like she was the first person who had understood what he was trying to say. Outside in the corridor, Nadia heard footsteps, more than one person, moving with the purposeful pace of people who had been sent somewhere rather than going there themselves. The sound stopped outside the recovery room door. Then someone knocked. 3 sharp, official knocks. Voss looked at Nadia. Nadia looked at the door. "Captain Voss," a voice said through the door. Male, formal, not anyone Nadia recognized. "We've been asked to speak with you regarding the jurisdiction request filed this morning." Voss's jaw tightened in a way that was brief but visible. She crossed to the door and opened it. There were 2 men in the corridor, not military, not lawyers, both in the kind of business casual that people wore when they wanted to look unremarkable. One of them held a folder and the other one held a phone, and neither of them looked at Voss with the kind of deference that people typically showed a JAG officer showing up with Federal Investigation Authority. "Captain Voss," the one with the folder said, "I'm representing Delworth Tactical Systems. We understand there's been some confusion this morning regarding equipment documentation, and we'd like to help clarify." "I'm in the middle of a federal investigation," Voss said. "We're aware. We're here to facilitate cooperation." He smiled when he said it. It was a very practiced smile. Nadia watched from the doorway and felt the shape of the next part of this taking form. The lawyers and the process and the systems designed to slow things down until evidence got stale and witnesses got tired and the whole thing quietly stopped. She had watched that happen before. What was different this time was that Cato was standing in the room behind her, and there was an evidence bag in Decker's hand with a device that didn't exist according to Delworth's own paperwork. And Captain Renata Voss was standing in a doorway looking at a man with a practiced smile with the expression of someone who had heard every version of the word facilitate and was not interested in any of them. And Nadia Osei, who had been a combat medic and had been an army soldier and had been a person who reported what she found through proper channels and watched it get buried, was standing behind all of that, and she was not leaving. Not this time. The man with the practiced smile looked past Voss into the recovery room, and his eyes found Nadia, and for just a moment the practiced quality slipped and she saw something underneath it. Not nervousness exactly, but the specific alertness of someone who had just located the source of their problem. He knew who she was. He had known before he walked into this corridor. That slip lasted less than a second before the practiced smile came back, but Nadia had seen it, and she understood what it meant. This was not a reactive visit. They had not sent 2 men to Blackstone because a JAG officer had filed a jurisdiction request an hour ago. That was not enough time to get lawyers in a car and on a highway. These men had been moving before Voss arrived, possibly before Voss had even been called, which meant someone had been watching this situation since this morning, and that someone had access to Blackstone's internal communications, and that the window for what she and Decker and Voss were doing here was narrower than she'd thought. Voss seemed to reach the same conclusion at roughly the same moment, because she stepped into the corridor and pulled the door to Cato's room mostly closed behind her, not all the way, leaving Nadia on the other side of it with the evidence bag and the dog. "You're here to facilitate cooperation," Voss said to the man with the folder. "Then let's talk about the decommissioned equipment batch from 2021, the devices that Delworth certified as destroyed." The man's smile didn't change. "Captain, those records are proprietary. They're federal contract records. They're not proprietary to you. Our legal team will be happy to schedule a review of the relevant documentation. I'm not scheduling anything. I'm opening a formal investigation under UCMJ Article 134 and the Military Contracting Fraud Statute. If Delworth wants to facilitate cooperation, their legal team can contact the JAG office at Fort Liberty and ask nicely." She paused. "Or they can stand in this corridor and use words like facilitate while I proceed without them." The man with the folder looked at the man with the phone. Something passed between them that wasn't quite a signal but functioned like one. "We'd like to examine the device your team has taken into custody," the phone man said. First time he'd spoken. His voice was very calm. "No," Voss said. "As the manufacturer, you just told me you don't recognize that device. Your records say it was destroyed in 2021. Voss tilted her head slightly. "So which is it? Is it yours, or doesn't it exist?" Neither man answered. The corridor was quiet except for the faint hum of the ventilation system, and from somewhere deeper in the building, the sound of a dog vocalizing in a treatment room, sharp, repetitive barks that faded after a few seconds. "I'm going to need both of your names and your firm's contact information," Voss said, "and then I'm going to ask you to leave this facility while my investigation is active." Folder man produced a business card and held it out. Voss took it without looking at it. Phone man did not offer one. They left. Not quickly, not in a way that looked like retreat, measured, deliberate, the pace of people who had been told to gather information and had gathered what they came for. Nadia watched through the gap in the door. When the corridor was clear, Voss came back in and let the door close behind her. She stood with her back against it for a moment and exhaled through her nose. "They were here before I got here," Nadia said. "Yes." "Which means they had someone inside Blackstone's system. Or someone inside Blackstone making calls." Voss looked at the business card. The firm name on it was 3 surnames hyphenated together. "This is not a firm that Delworth keeps on retainer for routine contract issues. This is a firm they use when something needs to go away fast." Decker had been standing near the window. "How fast?" "Fast enough that 2 men were already in a car when I was still on the highway." She put the card in her pocket. "Which means we do not have as much time as I thought we did." She pulled out her phone and made another call. Not to Fort Liberty this time. Nadia heard a different name, a different office, the words Federal Contracting Oversight and Priority Flagging and Chain of Custody Documentation required by end of business today. It was a short call. When it was done, Voss looked more solid, the way people looked when they had gotten the backing they needed. "I flagged this with the DoD Inspector General's office," she said. "That creates a federal record that Delworth can't pressure Blackstone into making disappear. Any attempt to interfere with the physical evidence from this point forward is obstruction." She looked at the evidence bag in Decker's hand. "I need that transferred to Fort Liberty under documented military custody within the next 2 hours." "I can drive it myself," Decker said. "You can, and I'm going with you." She looked at Nadia. "You need to not be in this building when Cale finds out what I just filed." Nadia looked around the recovery room. The padded surface, the water bowl, half empty. Cato standing in the corner, watching all of them with the patient, exhausted attention of an animal that had learned to read human rooms very carefully. "I can't leave him here," she said. "He's being transferred to Fort Liberty Veterinary Care this afternoon under Decker's jurisdiction request. He comes with us." Voss said it simply, like it was already resolved. "Get your personal items. Don't take anything from the Blackstone system. Leave your work tablet on the desk. Nadia thought about the break room, her locker, the physical copy of her documentation. She thought about 2 years of linoleum floors and fluorescent headaches and department meetings where her name didn't get said. She thought about the fact that she was being told to leave a job by a JAG officer because she had filed an accurate medical report, and she felt the anger of it. Not the hot kind, but the cold, specific kind that had nowhere useful to go and so just sat in you like ballast. She got her bag. The drive to Fort Liberty took 53 minutes. Nadia sat in the back seat with Cato's head on her thigh and watched the flat North Carolina landscape move past the window and did not say much. Decker drove. Voss worked the phone in the passenger seat, call after call, each one brief, each one adding another layer to the structure she was building. Nadia heard names she didn't know, offices she'd only seen referenced in documents. At one point, Voss said, I need the full procurement history for Delworth's K9 equipment contracts going back to 2019, and then paused, and then said, I know it's a Friday, I don't care, and then ended the call. Cato slept for 20 minutes, which was the first time he'd slept, as far as Nadia could tell, since he arrived at Blackstone. His breathing was slower than this morning. The trembling had stopped entirely. She had her personal phone and her handwritten notes, and the photographs on the cloud server she paid for herself. That was what she had. It was more than she'd had in 2017. Fort Liberty's veterinary facility was on the eastern edge of the base, a newer building than Blackstone, better lit, with the specific quiet of a place that had proper soundproofing and enough staff. They were expected. Someone had called ahead. A veterinary technician named Specialist Ames met them at the intake bay and took one look at Cato and said, I'll set up the low-stimulation examination suite, without being asked, which told Nadia something good about the quality of the people here. The forensic examination took 3 hours. Nadia stayed for all of it, partly because Cato wouldn't let the examination proceed without her nearby, and partly because she needed to see what they found with her own eyes and not receive it filtered through someone else's report. The lead examiner was a major named Tobias Reinhold, a veterinary trauma specialist who had been working with military working dogs for 11 years, and who looked at the injury pattern under Cato's collar with the expression of a man who was seeing something he had been halfway looking for. These contact points, he said, not to Nadia specifically but to the room, are deliberate. This is not equipment wear. This is repeated targeted stimulation in a controlled pattern. He looked up. How long has this animal been wearing this collar? The equipment refresh was 14 months ago, Decker said from the doorway. But based on what we found in the records, the modifications may have been made after the initial issuance. The injury depth suggests at least 8 to 10 months of consistent contact. Reinhold straightened up. This is going to be a very detailed report. That's what we need, Voss said. Nadia watched Cato through the examination. He was not calm. He would not be calm in an examination room for a long time, probably. But he was managing, which was different. He knew where she was. When he started to escalate, she spoke and he settled. Reinhold noticed this without commenting on it, but she saw him file it away. When the examination was done and Cato was in a recovery suite that was cleaner and quieter than anything Blackstone had offered him, Voss pulled Nadia into a small conference room with a table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out at a parking lot, which was fine. Nadia was not in the mood for scenery. Reinhold's preliminary findings support everything in your report, Voss said. Combined with the device serial number, the decommissioned batch records, and Reinhold's documentation, we have enough to open a full federal fraud investigation. When? I filed the formal opening 30 minutes ago. Voss set her phone on the table. Here's what's happening now. The DoD IG office is pulling Delworth's full contract history for the past 5 years. That includes all K9 equipment procurement across 7 bases. She paused. Early count, based on the retirement records they've already pulled, 43 military working dogs retired early in the past 4 years with behavioral flags, across 6 different units. 43. The number sat in the room. Nadia had known it was going to be bigger than one dog. She had known it from the moment she'd recognized the Delworth logo on the maintenance sticker. But 43 was not an abstraction. It was 43 animals that had been in pain and had been labeled dangerous for it, and 43 handlers who had been told they were failing, and 43 cases that had been quietly closed when the paperwork said retired, behavioral unsuitability. "Where are they now?" she said. "The dogs." "That's complicated." Voss looked at the table. "Some were transferred to civilian adoption programs. Some are still in base care. Some—" She stopped. "Some what?" "Some of the retirement records show a transfer to a Delworth-affiliated rehabilitation facility in Tennessee. 12 animals." She looked up. "That facility hasn't responded to federal inquiry in 4 years. It's listed as active in the records." Something cold moved through Nadia's chest. "A rehabilitation facility that doesn't respond to federal inquiry." "Yes." "Delworth created the damage," Nadia said slowly, "documented it as behavioral failure, and then had the damaged animals transferred to a facility they controlled. That's what the records suggest." She thought about what someone would do with 12 military working dogs that were traumatized, that had behavioral flags, that were officially retired from service and transferred to a private facility that nobody was monitoring. Dogs worth tens of thousands of dollars each in training costs. Dogs with specialized skills. Dogs that, to anyone who didn't know what had been done to them, would look like unpredictable, unmanageable animals. "They were selling them," Decker said from the doorway. He'd been leaning against the frame, and he said it the way you said something when the conclusion had just arrived and you needed to say it out loud to make it real. "They were deliberately degrading the animals to get them off the military's books, and then selling them through the private facility." "That's what we think," Voss said. "We don't have proof yet." "The facility in Tennessee," Nadia said. "Someone needs to go there." "I've already requested a federal inspection order. It takes—" "How long?" Voss hesitated. 24 to 72 hours, depending on judicial availability. Nadia looked at her. "Delworth's lawyers were at Blackstone within 2 hours of me filing a report this morning. How long do you think it'll take them to make a facility in Tennessee look compliant once they know we're coming?" The silence in the room had a specific quality to it. The quality of people who understood the math and didn't like what it added up to. "I can't send anyone to that facility without an inspection order," Voss said. "That's the law." "I know." "Nadia, I know," she said again. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just doing the math." The math kept her up until 2 in the morning in the temporary quarters. Voss had arranged on base a room that smelled of institutional cleaning fluid and had a mattress that was too firm and a window that looked at another building's wall. She lay on the bed with her phone and went through everything she had. Her photographs, her notes, the timeline she'd been building in her head since 9:14 a.m. She thought about the 2 men in the corridor at Blackstone. Folder man with his practiced smile. Phone man who hadn't given his name. Phone man hadn't given his name. She'd been in the room, looking through the gap in the door, and she'd seen his face, and she'd seen the way he looked past Voss and into the room at her. She knew that look. She had cataloged it in 2017, memorized it the way you memorize things that had hurt you, because understanding the face of something that had tried to destroy your career was a form of protection. She got up and opened her photographs and went back through them. Not the injury documentation, not the device, but the environmental photos she'd taken on instinct in the intake room at Blackstone. Background details. The table with the equipment on it. The folder. And at the edge of one of the frames, blurred but present, a piece of paper that had been sitting underneath Decker's handling documentation when she'd first pulled it out. She zoomed in. The resolution was not good enough to read full sentences, but she could make out a letterhead. A company name. Not Delworth, a different name. A subsidiary maybe, or a partner company. She could make out 3 of the words clearly. Meridian Asset Transfer. She stared at that phrase for a long time. Asset transfer. For a company connected to Delworth's contract operations. She took a screenshot and sent it to Voss with a single line. "Can you run this company name through the procurement records?" She put the phone down, picked it up again 40 seconds later when it buzzed. Voss's reply was 3 words. "Where did you—" Then 10 seconds after that, "I'll call you in the morning. Don't share this with anyone yet." Nadia set the phone on the floor beside the bed and stared at the ceiling. Something was large here. Larger than modified equipment and manipulated retirement records, and 12 dogs in a facility in Tennessee. Large in the way that involved money at a scale where individual animals and individual handlers were just line items, rounding errors, things that got managed rather than considered. She had stumbled into the edge of something in 2017 and been cut away from it before she could see the full shape. She was looking at it again now from a different angle, 7 years later, and the shape was becoming clearer, and what she could see of it was not good. She went to sleep sometime after 3 and woke at 5:30 when her phone rang. It wasn't Voss. The number was Blackstone's main line. She answered it. "Ms. Osei," Dr. Cale's voice, very controlled, "I need to inform you that your employment at Blackstone has been suspended pending an administrative review. Your access credentials have been deactivated as of midnight." She sat up. "I see. This is not a termination. This is a precautionary measure during the review period." "Regarding what specifically?" "Regarding the unauthorized removal of facility property and the filing of documentation that misrepresents." "I didn't remove facility property. I took photographs with my personal phone. That's documented in the timestamps. The report you filed contains findings that are outside your... My report is now part of a federal investigation under the DoD Inspector General's office," she said. "If Blackstone has concerns about it, they can contact Captain Renata Voss at the JAG office, Fort Liberty." She paused. "Is there anything else?" A long silence. "Nadia." Cale's voice dropped into something that was not quite an appeal, but was adjacent to one. "You have been a good employee. I would like this to resolve in a way that... I'll wait to hear from the review board," she said, and ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. The room was gray with early morning, and the building across the way was a flat, dark shape against a slightly lighter sky. Fired. More or less. The word suspend was just the version they used when they weren't sure yet how much trouble they were in. She had been here before. The configuration was different, but the feeling was the same. The sensation of institutional ground giving way, of the system deciding that she was the problem rather than the thing she had found. She stood up, washed her face, got dressed. Cato was in the veterinary recovery suite 2 buildings over. She would go there first. She was halfway across the base when Voss called. "Meridian Asset Transfer," Voss said, no greeting. "It's a shell company, registered in Delaware, active since 2019, with a listed purpose of specialized asset remarketing. It has one client on record, Delworth Tactical Systems, and it has one major transaction in the past 4 years." Nadia stopped walking. "What transaction?" "The purchase of a veterinary rehabilitation facility in Clarksville, Tennessee." Pause. "Listed purchase price, $12,000. A licensed veterinary facility for $12,000. "That's not what facilities sell for," Nadia said. "No," Voss said. "It's not, which means the sale was not arm's length. Someone transferred the facility to a Delworth-connected entity for a fraction of its value, which is either a gift or a payment in kind." Another pause. "I've got a federal judge on the phone at 7 a.m. The inspection order is moving faster than I said it would." "How fast?" "Possibly today. But Nadia, I need you to understand something." Voss's voice shifted slightly. "When we go to that facility, I don't know what we're going to find. The records show 12 animals transferred there. Those records are 4 years old. There has been zero communication from that facility to any military or federal oversight body in 47 months. The implications sat in the air between them. "You think some of them are dead," Nadia said. "I think some of them may be, and I think some of them may wish they were." She paused. "I want you there when we go. Officially, as a contracted veterinary trauma consultant, I can authorize that under the investigation. Unofficially, because if there are live animals in that facility, you are the best person to walk in there and assess what they need before anyone else makes a decision about what to do with them." "When?" "I'll know by 8. Nadia ended the call and stood on the base road in the early morning with the gray sky overhead and the sound of a distant PT formation somewhere in the tree line. And she thought about 12 dogs in a building in Tennessee that hadn't been inspected in 47 months. She was at the veterinary recovery suite 4 minutes later. Cato was awake. He was standing near the door of his suite, and when she came in, he walked to her and pressed the side of his body against her legs, with the specific weight of an animal that had been alone in a strange place and was relieved not to be alone anymore. She put her hand on his back and stood there for a moment. "We're going somewhere today," she said quietly. He looked up at her. It might be bad when we get there. He held her gaze. The dark eyes were still exhausted, still carrying 8 months of weight, but they were steadier than yesterday. Something in them had shifted when the device had come off and been put in an evidence bag and been driven away from him. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't afraid of Decker. He was starting to understand, maybe, that the thing that had been hurting him was not the people around him, but the thing they'd been carrying without knowing what it was. Her phone buzzed at 7:43 a.m. A text from Voss. Judge signed at 7:38. We move at 10. And then a second message, 40 seconds later. Also, Delworth filed an emergency injunction in federal court at 7:15 to block our inspection. Nadia stared at the screen. Judge denied it at 7:37. The next message read, 1 minute before he signed ours. 1 minute, she exhaled. There's something else, Voss's next message said. The man from yesterday. Phone man. No name. We ran the partial image you described. He's not a lawyer. Nadia felt the hair on the back of her neck respond before her brain caught up. His name is Garrett Solon. He's listed as VP of Special Operations at Delworth Tactical Systems. But his background before Delworth, 12 years, various defense contractor roles, previous termination from federal service. Termination reason, misuse of military working animal programs. He's been doing this since before 2017, the final message read. And Nadia, his signature is on the decommissioning paperwork for the equipment batch that doesn't exist anymore. Garrett Solon had signed the document certifying that 18 devices had been destroyed. Garrett Solon had been standing in the corridor at Blackstone yesterday, looking at Nadia through a gap in a door. The car Voss had arranged was a dark sedan with a federal plates and a driver who didn't make conversation. Nadia loaded Cato into the back. He was coming, Reinhold had agreed to it, partly for Nadia's sake, and partly because Cato's presence at the facility in Tennessee might matter in ways that were hard to articulate and impossible to dismiss. And they were on the highway by 10:08 with Voss in the front seat, working her phone, and Decker in the back on Cato's other side, and the Tennessee state line 4 hours ahead. The call came in at 11:22. Voss's face changed when she answered it. Not dramatically. She was not a person who showed things dramatically, but enough that Nadia watched it happen and felt her own chest tighten in response. Voss said, "When?" and then said, "How many?" and then said, "Do not let anyone near that building until we arrive," and ended the call. She turned around in the front seat. The local county sheriff's office responded to an anonymous tip about an hour ago, she said, about the Clarksville facility. What did they find? Nadia asked. Locked. The whole facility is locked from the outside. Chains on the exterior doors. She paused. There is a vehicle registered to Delworth in the parking lot. Engine warm. Someone's inside, Decker said. Or someone was inside very recently. Voss looked at Nadia, and the sheriff's deputy reported that he could hear dogs inside the building. Not dead. Alive. Nadia looked at Cato. He was watching her with those steady dark eyes, and in the particular quality of his attention she thought, not for the first time, that this animal understood more about what was happening than any of them were comfortable acknowledging. Drive faster, she told the driver. He drove faster. They were 40 minutes out when Voss's phone rang again, and this time Nadia didn't need to read Voss's face to know it was bad news. She could hear the voice on the other end of the call from across the car, elevated and fractured with the specific quality of someone reporting something they couldn't believe. The facility's exterior security cameras just went offline, Voss said, even before she'd ended the call. All of them, simultaneously. That's not a power outage, Decker said. No. Voss was already dialing again. Someone cut them. Someone who was still in the building. Someone who had just realized that a federal inspection team was 40 minutes out and had decided that there were things inside that facility that could not be seen. Nadia's hand tightened on Cato's collar. From inside the building in Clarksville, Tennessee, according to the deputy who was still on site, standing at the locked exterior door with his radio in his hand and no authorization to enter. The sound of the dogs had changed. They were no longer vocalizing in the scattered, distressed way of animals in individual kennels. They had gone quiet. All of them. At once. Quiet was the wrong word for what the deputy described. It wasn't the quiet of animals that had settled or tired. It was the sudden, total absence of sound in a building that 30 seconds earlier had been full of it. The The kind of quiet that happened when something changed the air inside a space fast enough that every animal in it responded at once. Voss was already on the phone with the county sheriff requesting immediate backup and federal authorization for emergency entry before Nadia finished processing what that silence meant. "Someone sedated them," Nadia said. Decker looked at her. "Can you do that? To a whole building?" "Aerosolized agent through the ventilation system. If the kennels share ductwork, yes, fast and you wouldn't need to go near the animals." She felt the words come out of her in the flat, procedural way that bad knowledge surfaced when you needed it. "It's also how you'd handle a building full of traumatized dogs if you needed them quiet while you moved them, or—" She stopped. "Or what?" Decker said. "Or while you did something else." Voss ended her call. "Sheriff is 3 minutes out with 2 units. Federal authorization for emergency entry is being faxed to the county office now." She looked at Nadia. "How bad is aerosolized sedation for the animals?" "Depends on the agent, the concentration, and whether anyone monitored dosage." Nadia kept her voice level. "If they used something fast-acting and heavy and didn't calculate for individual body weight, some of them might go into respiratory depression." The car was moving fast. The driver had the lights on, no siren but weaving through midday highway traffic with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. "We need veterinary emergency response on site," Nadia said. "Not when we get there. Now." "Already requested," Voss said. "There's a civilian emergency animal clinic 12 minutes from the facility. I've asked them to stage a response team." 12 minutes was not nothing. 12 minutes was also not nothing in the wrong direction, if animals were in respiratory distress in an unmonitored building. Nadia kept her hand on Cato. He had gone very still in the back seat, not afraid, not trembling, but with a focused alertness she recognized as the behavioral shift that happened when a working dog's instincts came forward and the traumatized animal temporarily gave way to the trained one. He could smell something, or sense something in the change of the humans around him. Either way, he was paying attention in a different register than he had been 5 minutes ago. They were 23 minutes out. The facility appeared first as a low, flat roofline above a line of overgrown scrub pine, and then as a gravel parking lot with 2 sheriff's vehicles and a white sedan and the building itself. A converted agricultural warehouse, long and low, with corrugated metal walls and a rusted gutter on the south side, and chain-link fencing around the perimeter that had been there long enough to have small trees growing through it. The kind of building that looked unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what was inside it. The white sedan with the warm engine registered to Delworth had moved. It was gone. Nadia noticed it before Voss did. She said nothing, just noted it. The empty space in the gravel, where tire tracks were pressed deep and fresh. Someone had left in a hurry. Someone had been inside when the cameras went offline and had used the 14 minutes of their drive time to get out. Voss noticed it 30 seconds later and made a call that Nadia gathered was to have county units flag all vehicles on the surrounding roads. The chains on the exterior doors were heavy-gauge padlock chains, the kind used on commercial storage facilities, looped through the door handles at 3 points. A deputy named Garza met them at the perimeter fence. He was in his early 30s, a little pale, and he'd clearly smelled something through the ventilation gaps in the wall because he kept breathing through his mouth. "We haven't been inside," he said. "Waited like you asked. But—" he paused. "It's quiet in there, real quiet." "How long since the sound stopped?" Voss asked. "About 25 minutes now." 25 minutes. Nadia did the math on sedation agents and did not share the result. The county emergency locksmith had the exterior chains off in 4 minutes. Federal authorization was confirmed by radio while they were working on the 3rd lock. Voss confirmed her identity and authority on record with Deputy Garza, and then looked at Nadia and said, "You're in as contracted veterinary trauma consultant under this investigation. That's official. Anything you assess or treat in that building is documented under federal chain." "Understood." "And Nadia," she paused, "Solon is not in that building. He left before we got here, but what he left behind is—" Nadia nodded. Decker had taken Cato's leash. The dog was on his feet, ears fully forward, nose working the gap under the door. He was not distressed. He was doing what he had been trained for years ago to do, before 8 months of something else had buried it. Reading a space before anyone entered it, processing information that human senses couldn't access. Let me go in first, Nadia said, to Voss, to Decker, to the general arrangement of people in authority in the parking lot. Procedure says, the deputy started. The procedure for a space with potentially sedated animals is not the same as a criminal entry procedure, Nadia said. If there are animals in there in respiratory distress, every second of incorrect handling makes it worse. I need to go in and assess before anyone else moves anything. Voss looked at her for 1 second. Garza stays with you. Decker, bring Cato and stay at the entrance until she signals. The door swung open. The smell hit first. Kennel smell amplified by a closed space. Underneath it something else, something chemical and sharp that confirmed what she'd guessed in the car. Isoflurane derivative. Aerosolized. The concentration was dropping now that the exterior door was open, dispersing, but in a sealed building it would have hit fast and hard. The interior was dim, some skylights in the roof, most of them filmed with grime that filtered the afternoon light to a dull gray. The building was divided into a long central aisle with kennel runs on both sides, heavy-gauge chain-link panels with concrete flooring. 12 runs. She counted them as she moved down the aisle, and the count matched the number Voss had said. 12 animals, 12 transfer records, 47 months. They were all down. Every one of them. On their sides or their sternums, in the still heavy positions of animals under chemical sedation. She moved fast, stopping at each run, eyes and hands working through the wire. Rise and fall of the chest, color of visible mucous membranes, ear flick response when she raised her voice. She was talking as she moved, not to Garza, just talking, the running verbal documentation habit she'd built in the army when you needed a record of what you assessed in what order. Run 1. What? Male shepherd, mid-sized, respirations present, rate approximately 8, shallow but present. Run 2. Female Malinois, respirations present, rate 6, posture lateral, watch for aspiration. Run 3. She stopped at run 3. The dog in run 3 was not sedated. He was a large male Dutch shepherd, older than most of the others, with a gray muzzle and one ear that had been damaged at some point and healed crooked. He was standing at the back of his kennel, pressed against the far wall, watching her with fully alert eyes. He was the only one standing. I was also the one making no sound at all, which was why the deputy had said the building had gone quiet. This dog had apparently never been making noise to begin with. She looked at his collar. No tactical device, no modification visible. She looked at his body condition, thin but not critically. She looked at his face. He looked back at her with the patient, assessing attention of a dog that had been waiting for something specific for a very long time. She moved on. She had to. By the end of the aisle, she had an assessment. 11 dogs sedated, all with present respirations, 3 of the 11 with shallow enough rates that she needed oxygen support and monitoring immediately. 1 dog alert and standing. None appeared to be an immediate critical crisis, which meant the agent used had been calibrated, barely, but calibrated. Whoever had deployed the sedation knew enough about the animals to not kill them accidentally, which meant Solon or someone in Delworth's operation had veterinary knowledge, or access to someone who did. She came back to the entrance and told Decker to bring Cato to the midpoint of the aisle and keep him there, then called the staging emergency team and gave them the assessment in clinical shorthand, drug type suspected, respiration rates, 3 priority animals, equipment needed. The team was there in 9 minutes and moved with the competence of people who had been briefed correctly. Cato stood in the aisle while the human activity moved around him. The dog in run 3, the alert one, the one who hadn't gone down, watched Cato from the back of his kennel. Something passed between them that Nadia had no vocabulary for but recognized as real. Cato's tail moved once, low and slow. That one wasn't affected, Decker said beside her. Or he metabolized it faster, or he didn't eat from the facility feed. She looked at the dog. Or whoever deployed the agent knew about him and exempted him. Why would they exempt one dog? I don't know yet. She looked at the old dog's ear, the heel damage. She looked at his eyes, alert, waiting, not aggressive, not afraid. What's your designation? She said to the dog. She wasn't expecting an answer. She was looking at his body language and the way he held himself, and the fact that he was the only one standing in a room where every other animal was down. She went to the run door. Garza put a hand up. "Ma'am, we don't know." And she said, "I know," and opened it anyway, and the dog came to her and sat, and pressed the top of his head against her sternum and held it there. His ID tag had been removed. The ring on his collar was empty, but his microchip, read by the emergency team's scanner 2 minutes later, returned a number. Voss typed it into her phone. Voss's face did something complicated. His designation is Bravo 7, she said. He was retired from service in 2020. Behavioral unsuitability flag. She looked up. He was assigned to the explosive detection unit at Camp Lejeune. Another pause. His last listed handler was a sergeant first class named Dorian Osei. The name landed in the room. Nadia had not moved. She was aware of Garza to her left and Decker behind her and the emergency team working at the far end of the aisle, and she was not moving. Osei, Decker said carefully. Is that my brother? She said. Her voice was doing something she couldn't fix. He was killed in 2020. IED, Camp Lejeune Transit Convoy. Nobody said anything. Bravo 7 was his dog, she said. I was retired after Dorian was killed. Behavioral unsuitability. She looked at the dog against her chest. He was grieving. They called it unsuitability. The dog, Dorian's dog, didn't move. He stood with his head against her and breathed. She put both arms around him. She allowed herself exactly 40 seconds of that. She counted them. It was not enough, and it was what she had, and then she stood up and turned around because there was work to do, and the work was the thing she could control. I want this dog's full transfer record, she said to Voss. Her voice was back. Everything from his retirement processing to this facility. Every signature. You'll have it, Voss said quietly. And I want to know whose signature authorized his retirement flag. Quote. The answer to that question arrived 3 hours later, in the mobile command unit that Fort Liberty had dispatched to the Clarksville site, a repurposed logistics vehicle with fold-down desks and satellite connectivity that Voss had converted into a field investigation hub with the efficiency of someone who had done this in less convenient circumstances. The retirement authorization for Bravo 7, signed 4 years ago, carried 2 signatures. The first was a base veterinary officer who had since left the service and, according to Voss's contact at the DoD, was currently listed as a consultant for a private firm. The second signature, on the transfer documentation to the Meridian Asset Transfer Facility, was Garrett Solin's. Solin had signed the dog into this building. Solin had been in this building recently enough that his vehicle was still warm when they arrived. Solin was somewhere on the roads between Clarksville and wherever he was going, and law enforcement had been looking for that vehicle for 3 hours. At 4:47 p.m., they found it. Abandoned at a regional airport 26 miles north. The car was empty. The airport had 3 outbound flights in the window that fit. 2 domestic, 1 private charter. He's running, Decker said. He was already running when his cameras went offline, Voss said. He knew the inspection order was coming before we were on the highway this morning. The emergency injunction, Nadia said. He filed it at 7:15. When the judge denied it at 7:37, he knew we were coming, which gave him roughly 4 hours to decide what to do about the facility. Voss was typing while she talked. The sedation deployment was not evacuation prep. He didn't have time to move 12 animals and cover the evidence, so he made them quiet and he left, and he hoped the sedation would complicate our assessment long enough for his lawyers to... Her phone rang. She looked at the screen and answered it immediately. The call lasted 40 seconds. The private charter, she said when it ended. Destination was Nashville. The plane landed 20 minutes ago. Solin wasn't on it. He must have switched before boarding. She set the phone down. He's a ghost right now. Not for long, Decker said. You've got a federal warrant? Being processed. But a man with Solin's resources and a 4-hour head start. She stopped. Didn't finish it. Everyone in the room understood what a 4-hour head start meant when someone had money and the motivation to use it. Nadia had been sitting at the far end of the fold-down desk with Bravo 7 on the floor beside her and the contract records on the laptop in front of her, reading. She had been reading for 90 minutes since the emergency animal team had stabilized the 11 sedated dogs and moved them to the veterinary staging area outside. Reading contract records was not what she was trained for, but she knew what she was looking for, which was sometimes the more important variable. There's a pattern in the retirement documentation, she said. Voss looked over. The 12 dogs transferred here, all retired on behavioral unsuitability flags. all flagged within 90 days of a Delworth equipment refresh to their units. She scrolled. But the flag timing isn't random. It clusters around contract renewal windows. Every time Delworth was up for renewal on a base contract, behavioral retirements in the K9 program at that base increased. She turned the laptop so Voss could see the timeline. They were generating the retirements on demand, creating the supply. Voss leaned over the laptop. Nadia watched her read and saw the moment the full picture landed. They needed retired animals to justify the facility's operation, Voss said slowly, and they needed the facility to process the animals they were retiring. It's a closed loop. The equipment degrades the dogs, the behavioral flags retire the dogs. The transfer moves the dogs to a facility they control, and then the dogs are sold, Nadia said, through Meridian, as non-military working animals. The training alone is worth $40,000, $60,000, $80,000 depending on the specialty. 12 dogs, even at low-end value, is close to $500,000. She paused. And they've been running this for 4 years. Decker made a sound that wasn't quite a word. That's before you count the fraudulent contract billing, Nadia continued, charging the government for standard equipment while supplying modified equipment. The difference in manufacturing costs between a compliant device and a modified one is maybe $200 per unit. Across 43 retirement-linked equipment refreshes at 7 bases over 4 years. Millions, Voss said. Conservative estimate. The room was quiet for a moment except for the hum of the satellite equipment and Bravo 7's breathing and the distant sound of vehicles on the access road outside. We need to find Solon, Decker said. We're looking, Voss said. But right now I need to keep building what we have so that when we find him, he can't argue that we don't have it. She looked at Nadia. Everything you just showed me, I need that documented and signed and attached to the formal record today. I can do that. And your original report from Blackstone, the one Cale tried to get you to walk back. That report is now the opening document of a federal fraud investigation. I want you to understand what that means. Nadia looked at her. It means it exists on record, with my name on it. Yes. She thought about 2017, about the report she'd filed that had gone nowhere, or had appeared to go nowhere, had appeared to be swallowed by the system and digested without result. She understood now that it hadn't been swallowed. It had been suppressed specifically, deliberately, by people who knew it was accurate and knew it pointed toward what they were doing. You didn't work that hard to suppress something that wasn't a threat. She had been a threat in 2017. She just hadn't had enough around her to survive it. I understand, she said. Ots. The stabilized dogs were transported to Fort Liberty's expanded veterinary facility over the course of the evening in 2 runs. Nadia rode in the first transport with the 3 priority animals, monitoring respirations, running IV fluids on the Malinois, whose rate had been lowest. The emergency vet from the civilian clinic, a compact, efficient woman named Dr. Samara Ewan, who had not asked a single unnecessary question since arriving on site, worked beside her without ego and without jurisdiction games, just doing the thing that needed doing, which was the only way Nadia had ever wanted medicine to work. Bravo 7 rode in the second transport. At Fort Liberty, the recovery suite from the previous night had been expanded. Reinhold had pulled in 2 additional staff members. 12 kennels, properly equipped, monitored. The animals came in one by one, were assessed, given what they needed, and placed in clean, quiet spaces that were nothing like what they'd been in 6 hours ago. By 10 p.m., all 12 were stable. Not recovered. Stable was not recovered. Stable was the beginning of a process that would take months, and some of them might carry what had been done to them for the rest of their lives. But they were alive, and they were in a place where the people around them wanted them to be, and that was not nothing. That was not nothing at all. Nadia was sitting on the floor of Bravo 7's kennel at 10:23 p.m. when Voss appeared in the doorway. We found Solon, she said. Nadia looked up. He didn't get on any flight. He got a rental car at the airport under a secondary ID. We traced it through a toll transponder 3 hours ago, heading west. She paused. He's in custody. Tennessee State Police 40 minutes ago on a highway outside Memphis. The breath she let out was longer than she'd planned. He's asking for his lawyers, Voss continued. He'll get them, but what he won't get is the room to maneuver that he would have had yesterday, or this morning, or 6 hours ago. Because the record is built now. The evidence is in federal custody. 12 living witnesses are in that building. She looked at the dog beside Nadia. 13, including this one. What happens to Blackstone? Cale will have to answer for the suspension. Whether it becomes something more serious depends on what we find about his communications with Delworth's representatives. Specifically, whether he was coordinating or just being pressured. She paused. My read is that he was being pressured. That doesn't excuse it, but it changes the shape of his exposure. And my report? Reinstated as of 2 hours ago. I've already been in contact with Blackstone's federal contracting oversight body. They've been notified that the suspension was retaliatory interference with a federal investigation. She said it without emphasis, just as fact. You'll receive formal written notification tomorrow. Nadia looked at Bravo 7. He was asleep. Finally, genuinely asleep, the kind of heavy, real sleep that bodies fell into when they stopped bracing for the next thing. She thought about Dorian, about what it meant that his dog had ended up in that building, retired for grieving and then sold into a scheme that used military animals as commodities. She thought about the fact that she had walked into Blackstone yesterday morning for an ordinary shift and had found the end of a thread that led here. She thought about whether she believed in the kind of coincidence that put Bravo 7 on that examination table and her in that room. She didn't know what she believed about that. She knew that she was here. She knew that the documentation existed. She knew that Solon was in custody and the record was built and 12 animals were alive and stable in the building around her. She knew that Decker was somewhere in this facility doing whatever handlers did when they needed to process what they'd learned about the last 14 months. She knew that Voss was still working because Voss was always still working. She knew that tomorrow would be complicated in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. Lawyers and depositions and the institutional machinery of accountability, which moved slowly and unevenly and produced imperfect results even when it worked. She was not naive about any of that. But something else was also true, something she turned over carefully because it was fragile in the way true things sometimes were. She had filed an accurate report. She had documented what she found. She had not walked it back. And the record existed, with her name on it, and it could not be made to disappear. She was sitting on that thought when Voss's phone buzzed. Voss looked at the screen. Her face did something that Nadia had not seen it do in 36 hours of watching it process bad news and difficult calculations. What? Nadia said. Voss turned the phone. It was a message from the DoD Inspector General's office. Not about Solon, not about Delworth's contracts, or the Meridian Shell Company, or the retirement records. It was about her. Specifically, it was about the medical discharge from 2019 that had ended her Army career. The borderline finding, the board decision, the process that had been described to her at the time as routine and had never felt routine, and that she had spent 2 years trying to partially contest through channels that returned her paperwork with polite denials. The message was 6 lines. Voss read it once before handing over the phone, which was unusual for her. Voss was not a person who handed things over without knowing what the other person was going to do with them. The IG's investigation into Delworth's contractor network had flagged a secondary file. Internal communications from 2018 and 2019 showing coordinated outreach between a Delworth-connected government relations firm and members of the Army Medical Review Board that had processed Nadia's discharge. The communications discussed her. By name. They discussed her 2017 report. They discussed the desired outcome of the upcoming medical review. The discharge had not been routine. The borderline finding had been found and flagged for action because Delworth had needed her gone. Nadia read the 6 lines twice. The phone felt very ordinary in her hand. The kennel floor was cold concrete through her clothes. Bravo 7 breathed steadily in his sleep 2 feet away. She handed the phone back. There's going to be a formal review of your discharge, Voss said. Given what this shows about the board communications, the IG believes, can we do this tomorrow? Nadia said. Voss stopped. I'm not saying I don't want to deal with it. I do. She looked at the sleeping dog. Can we do it tomorrow? Yes, Voss said. We can do it tomorrow. She left. The facility sounds settled into the night rhythm of animals sleeping and equipment humming and the occasional quiet footstep of a technician doing rounds. Nadia sat with Dorian's dog and did not try to name everything she was feeling because some of it didn't have names yet and the rest of it could wait. What she had not anticipated in any version of how this day might have gone when she woke up at Blackstone at 5:30 yesterday morning, was that the evidence on Cato's body would open a door that led not just to Solon and Delworth and 43 retired animals, but to the event that had cut her life in half 4 years ago and left her doing work she was overqualified for in a building where nobody said her name. She had walked through that door accidentally, and now she was sitting on the other side of it, and the shape of what came next was something she couldn't see clearly yet. But behind her the door was open, and the record existed, and the record said what had happened. Tomorrow, the lawyers would start. Tomorrow, the institutional machinery would engage. Tomorrow, Cale would receive formal notification, and Solon's legal team would begin constructing their defense, and the IG's office would contact her about the discharge review, and there would be questions and depositions and forms in triplicate and all the rest of it. But tonight, for the 11 minutes before she fell asleep against the kennel wall with her head against the wire, what was true was simpler. She had walked into a room with a dangerous dog. She had listened, and the truth that everyone else had missed was sitting right there, had always been sitting there, waiting for exactly one person to stop and hear it. She woke up with her cheek against the kennel wire and Bravo 7's nose 2 inches from her face. He was awake. Had been awake for a while, probably. Watching her sleep with the patient attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he existed in the world. Present, watchful, waiting for what came next without panic. Whatever Dorian had built into this dog in the years they'd worked together, it had survived 4 years in a building in Tennessee and a chemical sedation and the long gray weight of being forgotten. It was still there. She sat up slowly. Every muscle in her back filed a formal complaint about the kennel floor. She was 41 years old and she had slept on worse surfaces, but not recently, and her body had opinions about that. "Okay," she told Bravo 7. He put one paw on her knee. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the morning outside the facility's high windows was coming in pale and thin, not quite sunrise, but past dark, the specific gray light of early November that never felt like morning until it suddenly did. She thought about her brother, not in the way she usually allowed herself to think about him, which was briefly and around the edges, enough to know he was there without standing in the full weight of it. She thought about him directly, which she rarely did because it was like looking into something too bright. Dorian, who had laughed too loudly and driven too fast and had a gift with animals that their mother said came from their grandmother, but which Nadia had always privately believed was just Dorian, specifically, a thing that belonged to him and couldn't be explained by inheritance. Dorian, who had sent her a photograph of Bravo 7 4 months before he died, taken in a transit yard somewhere. The dog mid-yawn with his teeth showing and Dorian's hand on the back of his neck, both of them looking approximately identical in their ease. "He's the smartest dog I've ever worked with," Dorian had written under the photo. "Don't tell him I said that. He'll get insufferable." She hadn't thought about that photograph in 2 years. She thought about it now, here, with Dorian's dog's paw on her knee, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for the first time in a very long time. It was not clean. Grief was not clean. It sat in your chest with all its edges showing, and it did not resolve neatly into lesson or purpose. But it was real, and she had spent 2 years keeping it at arm's length, and maybe the keeping at arm's length had been its own kind of damage. She put her hand on Bravo 7's head. He didn't move. She allowed it to be what it was. What? The lawyers started at 8 a.m., the way Voss had said they would. Nadia was not in the room for most of it. That was intentional. Voss had told her the night before that her role in the formal legal proceedings would come later, in deposition and testimony, and that today's early sessions were about jurisdiction and charging and the structural work that lawyers did before humans entered the room. Nadia was fine with that. She had a facility full of recovering animals and a veterinary team that was excellent but stretched thin, and the work in front of her was concrete and immediate in a way that legal proceedings were not. She worked through the morning alongside Reinhold and Ewan, who had stayed over from the civilian clinic and showed no signs of leaving. The sedated animals were coming around in stages. The larger ones had metabolized faster. The 2 smallest were still slow. The Malinois from priority position 2 was eating soft food by 9 a.m., which was a good sign that nobody announced but everyone noticed. She kept checking on Cato between assessments. He was in a separate suite from the Clarksville animals, which was the right call. His trauma history was different, his recovery needs were different, and mixing him into the larger group before they'd all stabilized would have created dynamics that nobody needed right now. He was eating well. He let Reinhold examine him without Nadia present, which was new, which was progress that took Reinhold by surprise, and which Nadia took as a sign that something in Cato's internal landscape was beginning to shift. Decker came to find her at 11. He looked like a man who had also slept badly and was running on coffee and the specific fuel of someone who had made a decision about who they were going to be going forward. He stood in the doorway of Cato's suite and watched the dog for a while without saying anything. "How is he?" Decker asked finally. "Better than yesterday. Slower than I'd like, but the timeline for this kind of recovery isn't linear." Decker nodded. He looked at Cato, who had looked up when he came in, and then gone back to the chew toy Reinhold's team, had provided with the focused attention of a dog who was deciding whether to trust comfort. "I want to stay involved in his recovery," Decker said. I know I'm part of what happened to him, not the cause, but you were in the mechanism," Nadia said. Not harshly, just accurately. "That's not the same as being the cause, but it means the work between you is going to take longer." "I know." "He doesn't need you to feel guilty. That doesn't help him. He needs you to be consistent and patient and to never have that device in your hand again." Decker looked at her. "I put in for retraining, handler trust-based methods only. I told my unit commander this morning." "What did he say?" "He said it was my call." A pause. "He also said that 3 other handlers in the program have come forward in the last 12 hours requesting review of their equipment after word got out about the investigation." 3 handlers. 12 hours. The shape of the thing kept growing. She'd stopped being surprised by that and started treating it as information. Each new number, each new person coming forward, was the system doing what it was supposed to do once someone had handed it an accurate record to work with. The record existed now. The record was doing what records did. "Reinhold's team will set up a structured reintroduction protocol for you and Cato," she said. "It won't be fast. Don't try to make it fast." "Understood." He paused. "Thank you. For yesterday. For all of it." She looked at him. He meant it, and she could hear that he meant it, and she also didn't entirely know what to do with gratitude directed at her, which had never been something she'd had a lot of practice receiving. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "He still won't let anyone else hold the leash." Something in Decker's face broke open a little. Not quite a smile. Adjacent to one. "No," he said. "He's stubborn." "Yes," Nadia said. "He is." The federal proceedings against Garrett. Solon moved faster than federal proceedings usually moved, which Voss later explained was a function of the evidence being unusual in its completeness, physical, documentary, forensic, and corroborated across multiple independent sources before the defense team had time to organize a counter-narrative. Solon's lawyers filed 4 motions in the first week. 3 were denied outright, and 1 was tabled pending additional discovery. The pattern of denials was, Voss said, a signal. The signal was that the judge had read the record and found it credible. There were 2 weeks of depositions. Nadia gave hers on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room at the federal courthouse in Raleigh, sitting across from a court reporter and 2 assistant U.S. attorneys and a defense lawyer who asked her 17 questions about her qualifications before getting to the substance, apparently believing that her qualifications were the weakest part of the prosecution's case. He abandoned that line after question 11 when she answered his 12th question about her Army experience by describing, in precise clinical detail, 3 specific treatment procedures she had performed in forward operating environments that the defense lawyer had clearly not been briefed on. He moved on to the substance. She answered every question accurately. She did not speculate. She did not editorialize. She stated what she had observed, what she had documented, what her training led her to conclude, and she drew clear lines between the 3 categories. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She had been preparing for this her entire adult life without knowing it. Every suppressed report, every meeting where her name wasn't said, every moment of knowing something true and being told she didn't know what she was talking about had been, in some complicated and unsatisfying way, practice for sitting in this room and saying what she knew without apology. The defense lawyer had no more questions after 45 minutes. The assistant U.S. attorneys had a few redirect questions, and one of them, a younger woman with tired eyes who had been taking notes throughout, looked at Nadia at the end and said, "Is there anything you want to add that wasn't covered in the questioning?" Nadia thought about it. "Just that the dogs told us," she said. "Every one of them was trying to communicate what was happening to them." Cato for 8 months. Bravo 7 for 4 years. We document behavioral unsuitability, and we retire the file and we move on, and the information that the animal was trying to give us just disappears into the classification. She paused. That's a systemic failure. It's older than Delworth and it'll outlast this case. I think that's worth noting. The assistant U.S. attorney wrote it down. Well, the review board convened in December, 7 weeks after the Clarksville facility inspection. Nadia had been told what to expect. Voss had walked her through it twice, and a JAG-appointed advocate named Lieutenant Ferris had walked her through it a third time, and she had read the relevant regulations herself on 3 different evenings in the Fort Liberty temporary quarters she'd been occupying since Blackstone. She understood the process. She had prepared. She was still not prepared in the way that you couldn't be prepared for a room that was deciding something about who you were and whether what had been done to you was going to be officially acknowledged. The board was 3 people, 2 colonels and a civilian DoD official. The room had a long table and a window and very bad coffee that someone had left in a carafe on the side table and that Nadia drank half a cup of because it was something to do with her hands. The review took 4 hours. She testified. Voss testified. Reinhold submitted a written statement. The IG investigator who had found the board communications submitted the relevant documents and provided 20 minutes of direct testimony about the coordinated outreach from the Delworth-connected firm. The defense, which in this context meant the argument against reversing the discharge, a position nobody was actively advocating for but which the process required to be formally considered, consisted of the original medical board finding, which the IG's evidence had substantially undermined, and an argument from a records officer that the communications, while inappropriate, did not definitively prove the outcome had been predetermined. The senior colonel, a woman in her late 50s who had said very little throughout the 4 hours and asked 3 precise questions at specific moments, looked at the records officer during that argument and said, "The finding was borderline, the outreach was targeted and specific, and the outcome served the interests of the party that initiated the outreach. What level of definitiveness are you looking for?" The records officer did not have a satisfactory answer. The board deliberated for 50 minutes. Nadia sat in a hallway with Ferris and a vending machine that didn't have anything she wanted, and the sound of the building's HVAC, and thought about Dorian. She thought about the 2.5 years between her discharge and walking into Blackstone, the period she didn't talk about because it had been shapeless and expensive and had produced eventually a veterinary trauma nursing certificate and a job in a building with linoleum floors. She thought about whether she would have found Cato if she'd still been in the Army. She thought about whether she would have found Bravo 7. She didn't know. The chain of events that had led to a specific morning in a specific intake bay was not the kind of thing that could be fully reconstructed. She had ended up in the right place at the right time, partially because she'd been pushed out of the place she was supposed to be. That was not a comfortable thing to feel grateful for. She didn't feel grateful for it. She just acknowledged it as something that was true. Ferris came back from a walk down the corridor and sat beside her. He was 26 and had been thorough and earnest throughout this process and had sent her an email with 17 attachments explaining the review regulations, which she had appreciated. "You okay?" he said. "I'll be better in 50 minutes. He nodded. He'd been smart enough throughout this process not to offer reassurance that he couldn't back up with facts, which she respected. 47 minutes later, the door at the end of the hallway opened. The senior colonel came out. She looked at Nadia and she said, "The board finds that the 2019 medical discharge was improperly influenced by external parties with a financial interest in the outcome. The medical finding on which it was based has been reclassified as inconclusive. The discharge is reversed." She paused. "Your record will reflect honorable service through the date of reversal, with all associated status and benefits restored." Nadia heard it. She heard all of it. She said, "Thank you," because it was the accurate response. The colonel looked at her for a moment longer. She had the look of someone who was choosing whether to say something outside the formal register of the proceedings, and who decided to. "You should have been able to do this in 2017, she said. "I'm sorry it took this long." Nadia looked at her. There was nothing strategic or ceremonial in the colonel's expression. She meant it simply, as a fact, in the direct way that people stated things they wished were otherwise. "So am I," Nadia said. Garrett Solon was convicted on 7 counts in February: federal contractor fraud, tampering with government equipment, animal cruelty under federal statute, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and 3 counts of obstruction. His sentence was 14 years. His legal team had spent 4 months trying to argue that the evidence chain was contaminated, that the IG investigation had procedural errors, that the board communications were circumstantial. The judge found otherwise. He read a portion of the sentencing statement aloud, which federal judges were not required to do but occasionally did when they wanted the record to contain something more than the sentence itself. He read the section that described the mechanism: the equipment modification, the behavioral flag system, the retirement to resale pipeline, the deliberate use of military animals as instruments of fraud. He read it clearly and without editorial comment, because the facts, stated plainly, were their own editorial. Solon sat at the defense table in a gray suit and looked at the table. He did not look at Nadia. She was in the gallery, 3 rows back, between Voss and Decker. She watched him not look at her and felt nothing in particular about that. What she felt, and what she would remember later as the specific quality of that moment, was not triumph, not satisfaction in the expected sense. It was something quieter. The sensation of a pressure that had been constant for so long she'd stopped noticing it releasing all at once, and the strange, slightly vertiginous feeling of what remained when something you'd been braced against was finally, actually gone. Decker was looking straight ahead. His jaw was set in a way that she'd come to understand meant he was processing something he didn't have words for yet. Voss was making notes in her phone with the focus of someone who was already on to the next thing, which was very Voss, which was also why the thing that needed doing had gotten done. After the sentencing in the courthouse corridor, Decker said, 14 years. Yes, Nadia said. Is that enough? She thought about it honestly because he deserved an honest answer and not a comfortable one. I don't know. Enough for the fraud, maybe. The rest of it, she stopped. I'm not sure years are the right unit for some of what was done. He nodded slowly. How's Cato? She asked. Something in his face changed. He let me take the leash yesterday without Reinhold in the room. He said it in the flat, controlled voice of someone managing their emotional response to something. First time since before Bahrain. She said nothing. She didn't need to. He still watches the door when I come in, Decker said, like he's checking what I'm carrying. He might do that for a while. I know. Let him. Decker looked at her. That's what Reinhold keeps saying. Reinhold's right. The program that came next was not her idea exactly. It was built from several simultaneous ideas that arrived from different directions in the weeks after the sentencing, and she assembled them into something functional in the way she'd always worked, not by having a vision and executing it, but by seeing what was needed and building toward it without waiting for authorization to begin. Fort Liberty's veterinary division expanded its trauma rehabilitation capacity in the spring. 12 kennels became 22. The physical expansion was funded partly through a DoD reallocation from the frozen Delworth contract line, and partly through a congressional earmark that Voss's testimony before the Armed Services Committee had helped generate, though Voss was dismissive about her contribution to that specifically, and said the earmark would have happened anyway once the story was in front of the right people. The story had gotten in front of the right people. Nadia acknowledged that without excessive credit in any direction. She took the position of Trauma Rehabilitation Director in March. She almost didn't take it. She spent 3 days doing the math on what the role would require and what she'd be giving up in terms of direct patient care, which was still the part of the work that felt most like the work to her. In the end, Reinhold talked her into it over a cup of coffee in the break room, not with an argument but by listing, without commentary, the specific gaps in care that didn't have someone addressing them. And she listened and understood that she was the person with the training and the knowledge to address them, and that declining the role was a form of staying small that she'd done enough of. She took the role. The first thing she changed was the intake documentation protocol. Every military working dog that came through the facility was assessed for behavioral trauma indicators using a framework she developed over 3 months with Reinhold and Dr. Ewan and 2 animal behaviorists from a university program in Chapel Hill. The framework went into writing. It had her name on it, both of their names, and the behaviorist's names, and Ewan's name, because she had learned something about attribution, and she was going to practice it differently than it had been practiced on her. The second thing she changed was the training for incoming handlers. Not tactical training, That was someone else's domain. The training she developed was about reading animals, about the difference between an animal that was aggressive and an animal that was afraid, about what fear looked like in a working dog and how long it had to be sustained before it started presenting as behavior problems, about the fact that an animal communicating distress in the only language available to it was not a malfunctioning piece of equipment. It was a living thing, and what it was saying deserved to be heard. She taught the first session herself. 16 handlers, a mix of experience levels, sitting in folding chairs in a training room that smelled of floor wax and dog. They were polite in the cautious way of people who weren't sure what they were in for. She started by not introducing herself, just walking in and beginning, and covered 20 minutes of content before one of them said, "Who are you?" And she said her name and her rank, because her rank had been restored and she was using it now, and told them what she'd done in the army and what she'd found at Blackstone on a November morning, and watched their faces as the context arrived. After the session, a young handler named Specialist Wren came up to her and said, "My dog has been flagged for behavioral review. I've been telling my unit for 2 months that something's wrong with him, not with me. Nobody's listening." Nadia looked at her. She was 24 maybe. She had the specific exhaustion of someone who had been right about something and been told repeatedly she wasn't. "Bring him in tomorrow morning," Nadia said. "I'll do the intake myself." So, Bravo 7 lived in the Fort Liberty facility for the first 4 months of Nadia's tenure as directors. The arrangement was not officially sanctioned, and she didn't ask for official sanction. He occupied a suite in the recovery wing, was assessed and treated for the physical consequences of 4 years of inadequate care, and was given what he needed in the form of consistent handling, appropriate exercise, and the company of humans who were not asking anything of him except to be alive. In July, she brought him home. Her apartment was a 1-bedroom in Raleigh, not large, with a balcony that faced west and a landlord who had agreed, after a conversation that lasted 45 minutes, that a dog was acceptable provided he was not destructive. He was not destructive. He was the most self-possessed animal she had ever lived with, occupying whatever space he was given with the relaxed attention of a creature that had decided, after a long time of not deciding, that this was a safe place to be. She thought about Dorian sometimes when she watched him sleep on the floor beside her bed. She thought about the years she'd spent after her discharge keeping the grief at arm's length, treating it as something to be managed rather than something to be felt, which she now understood had been a version of the same mistake she'd seen the Army make with working dogs. Labeling the pain as dysfunction, filing it as a problem to be processed out, moving on without listening to what it was saying. She had been trying to discharge her own grief as behaviorally unsuitable. She saw that now. She didn't know what to do with the scene exactly, except to stop doing it, to let the weight of missing her brother exist without trying to reclassify it. It did not make her functional life worse. It made it realer. There was a difference, and she was still learning the shape of it. The Armed Services Committee hearing was in September, 10 months after Clarksville. Nadia had given depositions, had testified in the Solon trial, had answered questions from IG investigators and DoD oversight officials, and a journalist from a national publication who had spent 3 weeks understanding the case well enough to write about it accurately. She had done all of that. The committee hearing was different in scale, public, recorded, live-streamed, with an audience of people who were not legal professionals or investigators, but simply people who had been following what had been, by that point, extensively reported. She sat at the long table in the formal wood-paneled chamber and looked at 11 members of Congress who were looking at her, and she was not nervous. She had expected to be nervous, and she was not. The room was less frightening than the corridor at Blackstone had been on a Tuesday morning in November, when she'd been a nurse with a clipboard deciding whether to file a report that would cost her a job she'd already been passed over in 3 times. That had been the hard moment. This was just testimony. She spoke for 12 minutes from prepared remarks, and then answered questions for 35 more. She was direct and specific, and she used precise language because she'd learned that precision was the only thing that survived the various processes that statements went through between being made and entering the record. Toward the end of the questioning, a senator from a Midwestern state leaned into her microphone and said, "Ms. Osei, you were discharged from the Army in 2019 after reporting these issues the first time. That discharge has now been reversed. How do you feel about the years between?" Nadia looked at her. "I feel like time passed," she said. "And what I knew in 2017 was still true in 2024, and the animals that were being harmed in 2017 were still being harmed until a specific morning last November. She paused. What I feel about the years between is that they shouldn't have happened. Not to me and not to the animals and not to the handlers who were told they were failing when their equipment was failing them. She kept her voice level, not because she wasn't feeling things, but because the committee room was not the place for uncontrolled feeling. It was the place for accurate testimony. The system didn't fail because of one corrupt contractor. It failed because it wasn't designed to listen to the people and the animals who were closest to the problem. That's the thing that needs to change. Not just what Delworth did, but why they were able to do it for as long as they did. The senator wrote something down. Several of her colleagues wrote something down. The session ended at 4:15 p.m. In the corridor afterward, Voss appeared beside her with the unremarkable efficiency of a woman who was always exactly where she was needed. "That was good testimony," she said. "You've said that before." "It keeps being true." Voss looked at her. "There's a working group forming, DoD and VA joint, looking at the rehabilitation and treatment standards for military working animals across the full-service life cycle. They want someone from the practical care side who also understands the system failures." A pause. "I gave them your name." Nadia looked at her. "Without asking. I was confident you'd say yes." "I might not say yes." "You'll say yes," Voss said, and walked off down the corridor, already on her phone. Nadia stood for a moment in the corridor of the Capitol building with the afternoon light coming through the high windows, and the ambient sound of institutional activity all around her, footsteps and briefcases, and the distant murmur of another hearing somewhere down the hall. She thought about Cato in the reintroduction yard at Fort Liberty that morning, walking loose-leashed beside Decker for the fourth session in a row, still watchful, still checking what the people around him carried, but moving with a quality that was different from 3 months ago. Less braced, less ready to stop moving. Progress. Not resolution. Progress. Which was the realistic unit for what recovery looked like. She thought about Specialist Wren's dog, a Belgian Malinois named Kessler, who had come in flagged for behavioral unsuitability and had turned out to have a chronic pain condition in his left hip that had been generating the reported aggression for 6 months. 3 weeks of appropriate treatment, and the aggression had resolved almost entirely. The behavioral flag had been removed from his record. Wren had cried in the hallway outside the examination room, quietly, facing the wall, and Nadia had pretended not to see it because that was what the moment required. She thought about Bravo 7 at home in her apartment, probably asleep on her couch despite being told, with decreasing conviction over the past 2 months, that the couch was not for dogs. She thought about all the animals in all the kennels, and all the facilities that were still being run by people who hadn't learned to listen, about all the handlers who had been told they were failing, about all the reports that had been filed and suppressed and redirected back to the people causing the problem, across all the years before this particular thread had been pulled. She thought about what she'd said in that committee room, about the system not being designed to listen to the people and animals closest to the problem. It was true. It was also not a permanent truth. Systems were built by people, and they could be rebuilt by people. And the rebuilding happened exactly like this: one accurate report, one piece of physical evidence. One morning when someone looked at a frightened animal and chose to hear what it was saying instead of filing it and moving on. She said yes to Voss's working group. She said yes, knowing it would be slow and institutional and would produce results that were incomplete, and that she would spend significant portions of it frustrated with the pace of change. She said yes because the alternative was someone else doing it less well, and she was done deferring to people who did things less well while staying quiet about what she knew. She had been quiet long enough. Not timid. She had never been timid. She had been quiet in the way of someone waiting for permission to be heard in a room that was not going to give it. What she understood now, in a way she hadn't fully understood on a November morning in Blackstone's intake bay, even as she was doing it, was that the permission was never coming. The room was not going to hand it to you. You had to walk in and speak and document what you found and refuse to undocument it, and then do it again, and then do it again, and eventually the record accumulated enough weight that even the systems designed to ignore it had to reckon with it. That was not a comfortable truth. It was also not a crushing one. It was just the truth, with its edges showing, available to anyone who wanted to pick it up and use it. She walked out of the Capitol building into the September afternoon, which was bright and sharp-edged and smelled faintly of cut grass from somewhere. and she stood on the steps for a moment before moving toward the car. There were things ahead of her that were going to be hard. The working group would be hard. The next facility review would surface something she didn't want to find. There would be another Blackstone somewhere, another Kale with his careful language about scope of practice, another Delworth operating in the gap between the system's oversight capacity and its actual reach. She would file the report. She would document what she found. She would refuse to be the thing that disappeared when the institutional pressure came. She knew that now in a way that was not hope or resolution, but simply information. Something she knew about herself, the way she knew which way her hands moved when she was doing an examination. The way she knew how to read a frightened animal in a room full of people who had already decided it was dangerous. The truth had always been there. Someone just had to walk in and refuse to leave until it was heard. She walked down the steps and got in the car and went home.